Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really enlightening conference. I've never hung out with so many historians. I'm a geographer, and that's been great, actually. It's been really sort of eye-opening. So the paper that I'm going to give is part of my dissertation, and I was going to go do more sort of archival research this summer, and of course I wasn't able to do that. So at the end, I sort of do quite a lot of speculative kind of philosophy, right? And I hope that I can get into that. That's actually the stuff that I kind of had the most fun writing, I think. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts. What else? I just wanted to thank the organizers in particular for making this cognitive space, which for me has been really like incredibly valuable given the tidal wave of election news that's currently sort of washing over us all. It's been really important to me to like have to focus on this, right? And tear myself away from the New York Times or whatever. Okay, I will be playing some audio early on in this talk. It's a talk about sound, so I figured we should listen to something. I don't have a slideshow, but if the audio is too soft, too loud, let me know, gesticulate, and I'll stop it and we can talk about it. All right, here we go. Sounding maritime metal, listening to capitalism at sea. I recently listened to Capitalism from the deck of the French container ship Cendrillon, moving through the Northern Pacific Ocean at 20 knots. Around 200 miles south of the Aleutian Islands, standing amidst the container stacks on the ship's deck, the air was filled with the sounds of maritime metal, twisting and flexing against oceanic forces. Here's what that sounds like. Like a tall building lying on its side, the segmented steel skeleton of a large container ship is designed to torque and bend in rough weather and heavy seas. This inbuilt flexibility allows the ship to absorb enough of the energy generated by the wind, waves, and currents of the ocean to avoid breaking apart. For the 24 seafarers and one geographer aboard the Cendrillon, the ship's structural elasticity is experienced in two ways. First, as motion, that carries with it the potential to induce seasickness, and second, as noise. These effects are not unrelated. As the ethnomusicologist David Novak points out, the Latin root of the word noise is nausea, from the Greek root nos, which means ship. So noise, nausea, and ships go together, both phenomenologically and phonetically. The rolling and pitching of the 109,000-ton ship itself is not the most immediate source of these sounds, however. During my time on board, the Cendrillon was fully loaded. During my time on board, the Cendrillon was fully loaded, carrying 9,000 shipping containers from ports in China and Korea to the west coast of North America. Most of the noise on deck was generated by the containers, rhythmically groaning, cracking, and shrieking against one another and against the ship's hulking mass. What to make of these sounds, these metallic sonorities, as the composer Edgar Varese might call them? What can this noise tell us, if anything, about the ship and its cargo, or about the global logistical assemblage of which the Cendrillon is only one part? More abstractly, what might these sounds tell us about the global flows of capital that underpin the movement of the ship in the first place? Is sound a kind of evidence? And if so, of what exactly? Right, so around 90% of the 20 to 25 million shipping containers currently in circulation globally are made of Core 10 weathering steel, which was invented in the early 1930s by the US Steel Corporation for use primarily in the manufacture of rail cars. Today, Core 10 is produced primarily in China. Like many other metal alloys in the steel family, Core 10 is both cheap to manufacture and it has a high tensile strength being a measure of a material's ability to resist breaking under tension. Uniquely, Core 10 is infused with a copper, chromium, and nickel compound that makes it 4 to 8 times more resistant to atmospheric corrosion, aka rust, than ordinary steel. This trait manifests as a self-healing capability. When unpainted Core 10 is exposed to the atmosphere, it begins to oxidize like any other iron alloy. Soon, however, the alloying elements of core 10 cause a protective surface layer of fine textured rust to form, suppressing the corrosion rate and safeguarding the structural integrity of the base metal. In commercial documentation, this russet-colored coating is often described in biological terms as a kind of protective skin. As one weathering steel distributor evocatively describes it, the alloying elements in core 10 produce, quote, produce compounds that clog the pores at the rust-steel interface. Despite this self-regenerating adaptability, core 10, like all materials, is constantly in the process of failing. Weathering steel struggles against the corrosive effects of oxygen exposure longer than ordinary steel, but even rust-resistant metal eventually rusts out. We can think of core 10 then as a particularly vivid example of a material that is, in more than one sense, active or agential. It changes and flows over time, both in reaction to external events and as a result of the liveliness of its own internal chemical structures and properties. As the geographer Andrew Barry notes, metals are extraordinarily fluid, full of local sources of transformation and instability. In this light, core 10's resilience to corrosion, to fractures and cracks, to the passage of time itself, and also its inevitable failure, might be taken as indicative of a certain material unruliness. Sometimes, as with the sounds we heard earlier, this unruliness resonates in a register that is audible to human ears. I've described core 10 at some length here, and I do it at more length in the written paper, because in the context of container shipping, weathering steel is a key interface between sound and capital. There is, of course, a long-standing association between metal and capitalist power, which I also go into more detail in the written paper. This is described explicitly by the sociologist Max Weber, who is responsible for what is almost certainly the most influential metallurgical analogy in the social sciences. I speak, of course, of the iron cage, in which, according to Weber, all of us who live in capitalism are confined. Except Weber didn't actually come up with the image of the iron cage at all. In a definitive recounting of the history of English language translations of Weber, Peter Baer shows that it was Weber's translator, the Harvard sociologist Talcott Parsons, who rendered capitalism analogically as a cage made of iron. According to Baer, a more precise English translation of Weber's own German language metaphor for capitalism would be a shell made of steel. So a shipping container, right? As Baer describes it, this steel shell is both a more complex and ultimately a richer image than the iron cage. In the written draft of this paper, I quote at length from Baer's piece. Here, I'll just give you a few sentences. Quote, as a metal that is associated in the European context with modernity, fabrication, ductility, and malleability, steel appears to have much more in common with rational bourgeois capitalism than the iron of which it is a refinement. Just as steel involves the transformation of iron by the mixing of carbon and other elements, so capitalism involves the transformation of labor power into commodities, end quote. Okay, so there's of course a vast amount more to say about steel, right? And this is where my archival research is going. But I want to return to sound. So to restate the question I started with, what can we learn about capitalism by listening carefully to core 10 weathering steel? So
2-minute warning.
2-minute warning, oh boy. Okay, I propose 3 speculative answers to this question. First, listening in on capital's movements might be a novel and subversive means of representing capitalism differently, not as it is often imagined as a well-oiled system of global domination, but rather, as Nigel Thrift once put it, as an impulse without determinate goals. The sounds of shipping containers in motion that we heard earlier are clearly not the result of a single or simple cause. Rather, we must think of these sounds as the outcome of a complex set of contradictory forces, including things like ocean currents, water pressure, salinity, temperature, and wind, but also, and I think more importantly, the whole bloody, racialized political economic history of oceanic capitalism. Put simply then, these metallic sonorities I've been talking about are what Louis Althusser might have called overdetermined sounds, which is just another way of saying that they resist analysis and are not reducible to the history of their making, or at least not in a way that we are capable of grasping sonically. Second, and this will be my final point here, given the interpretive challenge posed by this sonic overdetermination, we might embrace the impenetrability of these sounds and take them on as a particular kind of woolly or shaggy knowledge shot through with ambiguity. There is some precedent for this interpretation in sound studies. Writing against the concept of soundscape, Tim Ingold, an anthropologist, notes that sound is not an object of our perception, but a medium through which we experience the world. This through which is key. For Ingold, sound is like the weather. It is meteorological. We may be buffeted by sound, bathed, drenched, or drowned in sound. Listening is like immersing ourselves in a liquid or a gas. We move through it, and it in turn passes through us, muddying the distinction, at least temporarily, between something called sound and something called us. Stefan Helmreich posits that this experience of immersion is produced by the transduction of vibratory signals across a variety of media up to and including the air around and in our heads and the cartilage in the outer and inner ear. Transduction is like an elaborate, multiply mediated version of the children's game telephone, where someone whispers a word to someone else, and that person whispers what they think they've heard to a third person, etc., etc. Inevitably, by the end of the game, a dramatic loss of fidelity has occurred. Maybe this loss of fidelity is the point. Perhaps taking sound's indeterminate nature seriously is itself a means of critiquing the powerful logics, capitalist, scientific, philosophical, and otherwise, that seek to order the world into clearly demarcated, high-resolution objects and sensing subjects. In certain cases, perhaps studies of sound are capable of undermining conventional economic and scientific models of capitalist control and mastery, many of which rely in large part on optical technologies and visual metaphors. And I'll stop there.